Good afternoon, everybody. This is my introduction on the lecture on port cities. I'm fully aware this is not the ideal situation we are facing now, but there are so many problems, in particular for you as students traveling abroad with so many uncertainties. I hope that these lectures can continue and that we are able to work as good as we are able to do in these circumstances. Um, you already have noticed the manual which Martin has already sent to you and which includes the second part, which will be done by me, and the third part. In the second part, so normally we would start our lectures tomorrow. We start with the introduction on port cities, and in the manual I have introduced the three different topics I want to discuss with you in this week. Normally we would have about 12 hours of lectures, but I think this is for a lecture on the considering the circumstances that we should shorten that. And so I will introduce my slides, and I hope that we are able to come up with the readings I suggested, and that there are possibilities for groups to work together. This presentation is taken from Windows slideshow, which can be recorded, and I'd like to do so by uploading them with YouTube. So I'm not sure how it works out, so this introduction is also meant for me as a way to, well, it's a bit of trial and error. Well, it's a pity that we are not able to meet face to face, because although we have these new technologies, it's the first time I'm doing this, because normally I liked face to face interactive lectures, and well, there is no other way, and I hope that we are able to continue and keep as much as possible to the deadlines we already have approached. So normally I introduce myself, and I will do that now as well. So I'm Paul van der Laar. I'm an endowed professor of urban history at Erasmus University. So I teach an elective on urban history, and next to that, which is in fact my main job, is a director of the City Museum of Rotterdam. So I'm very much interested in how you combine academic research and public performances. So in a way you can say, in my role as a director of a museum and being an academic at the same time, I'm much into public history as well, because not in a way just doing history because it's interesting for an academic audience, but what can we do with history, make it relevant for today, issues of today. So in regarding your backgrounds and why you are following these local courses, that's what I want to combine as well. So my introduction on port cities is in relationship to what I believe are the major issues which you are dealing with, and these are already discussed very briefly in the manual. I will start. So this is the first part of lecture 1, an introduction and a definition on port cities and typologies. And some of the readings which are addressed to you are in particular on this subject. So I want to introduce that by my first slide. And the first slide is very interesting. The people who are there, they're on top of the Euromast. And the Euromast is constructed in 1960 in Rotterdam, when Rotterdam celebrated its 15 years of reconstruction. At that time, the port was really expanding, and the port and the city were in fact becoming detached from each other, which is some of the major issues which have taken place in the port development after the Second World War. Most port cities started to develop into distant areas because of the fact that there was the introduction of the container, but major transit ports like the port of Rotterdam, which is a port city floating on oil because of the industrialization of the Second World, already started with the separation with the ports from the city. So the people who are there are on top of the Euromast, and actually they're pointing their fingers towards the ship in the background. And this is the SS Rotterdam. And the SS Rotterdam, you could say, is the last symbol of the shipping lines using the connections between the Netherlands, in particular Rotterdam, and the United States. This was in an era when passenger ships were taken over in means of passenger transport by the air traffic. So the people on top of the Euromast actually addressing. So this is the 1960s, which is an age we see a lot of developments going on in the port development. And when you look at the definition from Oram, which already was taken in 1965, and it's interesting that he wants to describe a port complex. And he comes up with the port is in fact a system which is very complex, but it is looking ahead of it. It's always future based, but at the same time, its port cities are very much embedded into traditions, customs, etc. The things we do, path dependency arguments, like the economists would call it. And it's always because of the fact that port cities are always dependent on external shocks. There's always a way of how are we going to improvise. Improvisation, which is a typical part of the port culture. And we come to port culture in a more general way in the coming lectures. So, and I like to quote that if a lunatic from Mars had been entrusted with the job of wrecking the economy of a maritime country, he could point to many of the modern ports as his finest job. So if you look at all the things which are going on in port cities, it's complex. And if you ask people what is a port about, can you tell me, can you imagine it, can you define it, then it's not easy to do so. It's a very complex logistic system, cultural system as well, with a lot of traditions and background. So if we, but port cities are relevant because if you look at the major cities map on a world map, and you see that all the dots over there all have a relationship with port activities, and most of the port activities have a very long traditions. So you could say major cities are most of the time are port cities. And the thing we have to address is, although, and we'll come back to that when we are in the second part of the lecture, third part of the lecture, we will discuss the major port systems, that we are inclined to think that when we're dealing about urban developments, port cities do not come first into our mind. But if you look at these maps, then you can see that there's always a very much connectivity between urban development and the activities of ports. Although some port cities are not identified as port cities as such. If you will ask for London, although London is still an important port, New York, and you will ask what is your first identification of New York City or London, people will not address them as port cities in the first place. But we have to realize that almost all major cities have a background in relationship between the forelands and the hinterlands. Forelands and hinterlands are things which will be addressed by my colleague Hein Kleeman in more details, and the first round of globalization is something which you have already been discussed, introduced by Martin in his lectures. And some of the arguments Martin already put forward in his lectures will come along as well in my lectures. So if you look at the major city map today, you see the ports. And if you go back 100 years, then you can say, well, the global cities of 100 years ago are in fact the port cities. The most important cities are port cities. And Jürgen Ostenhamel actually says that the 19th century is the golden age of port cities. But we have to remember that because of the industrialization in the 19th century and the role of empire, we are very much inclined to look at port developments for a very narrow Anglo-Saxon perspective. But if you look at these maps, you see they're all connections. It's already a connected world, and the red lines are actually the world connecting by shipping lines. And these still exist, although we do not draw these maps in such a way because air traffic, already mentioned, is taken over. So the development of ports are very important. And if there is one reason why we should discuss the role of port cities in a global context, is because we have to realize that port cities, global cities, they were always very important, even going back to the 15th and 16th and 17th century. So there is a lot of, it's almost an ongoing process of the world being connected, and we have to address these different connections in time and how they developed. And my focus will be particularly on the developments since the 1850s about port systems. And of course, I'm very much interested in what happened to the port developments following the 1960s, 1970s. And that relates to the very important questions. What about the creativity of port cities? Something we are going to address in these lectures as well. So if we sum up the relevance of port cities, well, we can say, well, it's a multidimensional, it's interdisciplinary, and it's all about networks. If you look at these maps, you see these are the networks which are relevant. And we are dealing with, it's not just dots on a map, but all transformations with huge spatial consequences. And because these historical developments are relevant as well, because these historical developments tell you about relative strengths of maritime centers on a world scale. And in order to understand the developments, the spatial consequences, and the maritime networks, and we have to discuss them and research them and do that for all by doing it in a comparative way. So port cities, the relevance is because if you are dealing with port cities, then you do that in a comparative way. So it's not just stories about isolated port developments. No, it is how to come up with conclusions at external developments and port developments, but there's always the local responses to these external developments. And these developments are relevant because they have a very strong impact on the urban form. If you look at how cities developed, and port cities in particular, there's a very strong relationship between the trade relations in time and how they affected the urban form. And what happened to the urban form when in time? But it's not about the spatial context as well. It's about the cultural relationship. Because of these global networks, the maritime networks, people on the move, goods, etc., urban ideas travel along shipping lines. So if we come back to this huge map and we see all these dots on the line and these connections, and it's not one-way direction. There are always two-way directions as well. It's a combination of different interactive ways. So the other idea is that we have to look at how urban ideas traveled in time. We need to be aware that these connections were made because of these shipping relationships. But the ideas are implanted locally. And this comes to mind when we are discussing the waterfront transformation. Although you could say it's universal since the 1960s, 1970s, what are we going to do with the derelict areas, these port areas, which are not longer in use because of the changes in technology and the way of the containerization? But we have to look at the local consequences of these transformations. And then there's a universal agreement on the fact that the technology first shapes the port city region, be it the oilscapes which developed in the post-war industrial area, or the containerization which has had a major impact on the development of port city regions since the 1960s, 1970s. But we are not dealing with these processes only, because we have to look at what are the consequences of these processes for the region and about the identity of the port cities. And this is a very strong relationship with, we could say, the broader perspectives on maritime culture, which is an important aspect of understanding the differences in. Well, and there's a lot of discussion going on between different scholarships. And I think port cities are in particular relevant because we need to focus on the relationship between the port developments and the urban developments. And which is very easy to say, but it's not easy to research that. Because you have the port historians, you have the maritime historians, and they study maritime, they study shipping, but what about the urban context? And Frank Bruce, the late Frank Bruce, who's originally Dutch, but he was very famous because he did a lot of research on pre-industrial developments in an Asian and the Indian Ocean context, and he comes up with a very strict definition, because it's always the port creates a kind of urban community, but it's a relationship we have to develop. So in order to understand port city developments, we have to study them in a very close relationship. And a port is not just a place where goods and passages are transferred between ship and shore, as Reeves and others have argued, because it's not just about the economic development, but port cities are different, not just because of the economic development, but also because of the cultural and spatial developments. And we have to come up with the interdisciplinary. That's why port cities are so interesting, because of the not just a long-term perspective which makes it interesting, but also because of the fact that all different disciplines come together in port cities. And this relates to the aspect which are very important for the you could say perhaps not the real sciences, but you could say in sociology, in history, in all aspects of disciplines, you could say that there is a cultural turn, a spatial and global turn. The global turn is important, as already addressed by Martin in his lecture, first lecture, and I would say the seminal article on the spatiality of the global turn. So because of the global turn, we are forced to look different at a spatial context. Not just the spatiality, which is defined by national boundaries, as in a 19th century context. No, we have to deal with the fact that the national context is a very, well, strict way of looking at historical developments. And the global turn actually helps us in order to look different at spatial developments and cultural developments in time. So that's why the waterfront is in these lectures important, because the waterfront is an interesting part of studying the spatial connection on a global scale, and combining it with the cultural developments and urban history and planning history, as done by Carola Hein in her paper in 2016, which is not on your reading list, but she refers to this paper in another article which is on your reading list and which you are supposed to study for the first lectures. And the case study on waterfront, they are important in particular because the working ports have been redeveloped in cultural hotspots, gentrified areas and leisure waterfronts. And these are particularly the issues which you are working on. These are issues which are defining the question, what about the future of creativity in a port city context? These are the things I'm very much interested in, and there's not much literature on that, but I hope that we are able to come up with the major aspects and variables which are relevant in discussing these developments. And of course, because of the revitalization of the waterfront in the past 2 centuries, we come across a new urban literature in which historical port development and waterfront are redefined as new spaces. And I'm so glad that Martin already introduced you into the work of Diana Brandt, her new typology of port cities, which is actually based on a connection between spatial, economic and urban development. So I'm glad to refer to these lectures as well. So this slide is a port culture slide made by Carola Hein, my colleague from the Technical University Delft, and we are working together on a port city future program. Well, if you look at this map, this matrix, you see all the differences which are relevant in studying port cities. It's about institutions, the governance of ports. It's about spaces, tangible part of the port development, not just logistics, but all parts which are relevant in order to create the tangible aspects of the port development. And a very important part is the port culture, and the culture which is, well, very difficult to define. What do we mean with port city culture? Anyway, we focus on the shared values which are relevant in order to understand why ports and governments, port city governments, do make certain decisions in particular time frames. So these are important elements in order to create the port city development. In particular, when we are going to focus in one of our next lectures on the waterfront redevelopments and the creativity of the port cities. And the underlying question is, if you look at these complexities of the port development, are we able to come to the conclusions, are port cities actually capable of turning into creative places and creativity? Firstly, from a maritime perspective, for instance, in the part of the heritage culture, or secondly, are we able to create new ways of creativity which are more in line with the post-industrial developments? And although port cities are familiar of being resilient in times of external distresses, the question still is relevant. Do we think that port cities are able to come up with new creativity? And when we are looking at this creativity, what kind of creativity is related to, for instance, the waterfront? These things all come across in the lectures these days. So this is almost the